All right, so Paulus is next. He jumps into the argument. And Paulus is a little bit younger and brasher. So, you know, note that. Plato, does fill out his characters fairly well. Um, Paulus begins by, interestingly, Paulus says, wait a minute. Okay, I'll tell you what. I'll ask the questions and you answer them, Socrates, which probably is a good idea because every time Socrates is asking the questions, the person gets refuted and, um, loses the argument. So perhaps it'd be a good idea if I ask the questions, Paulus thinks. And so Paulus says, you tell me what you think rhetoric is, he says to Socrates. And to this, Socrates responds that rhetoric is not even an art at all. Art is a broad term here, again, a translational thing. In other words, it's not even a subject matter. It's not even a real subject. It's just a knack, like cookery or cooking. Take a little offense to that since I was a chef for a while. But anyway, he said it's not an art, it's just a knack. It's a form of flattery. It's a bogus art of politics. It's pretending to be politics, but it's not really politics. Politics is the real art. Justice and legislation are the real political arts. Rhetoric is just pretending to be justice. It's not a real art at all. It's just a form of flattery. It aims at pleasure rather than the good, like a cook, and his example is a cook and a doctor. So the doctor is telling you to eat your broccoli and your vegetables, and the cook is whipping up a batch of chocolate chip cookies. The cook is aiming at flattery, and the doctor knows what's really good for you. That's the idea here. So the real art is being a doctor, and rhetoric is just a form of flattery. I should note, by the way, I always like to note here that rhetoric is not always a form of flattery. And I think Plato was well aware of this fact. It plays on emotion, so it can be flattery if just a simple thing, nationalist thing, for instance, like rah rah rah, America's the best. That's kind of a form of flattery, because if you say America's the best and I'm an American, hey, I'm the best. I mean, it's a form of flattery. It's sort of trying to play on your emotions. But I should note that it plays on rhetoric can play on other emotions like fear. The terrorists are hiding under your bed, and therefore you need to make sure that you give me all the power so I can protect you. That kind of thing too is rhetoric. So rhetoric is a kind of emotional play, which isn't always just flattery. Anyway, Paulus is he can't keep his mouth shut because this is totally insult. He's trying to take Gorgias' place as being a teacher of rhetoric, and Socrates is saying it's not even a real field of study. Paulus is offended. He's very offended. So he backs off from his idea that he's going to ask questions and starts making assertions. And his first assertion is that doesn't everybody want to be a tyrant? Okay. Doesn't everybody want to be a tyrant? Which may seem a little off the cuff and out of place. But it does relate very much to, because remember what Gorgias promised rhetoric could do. Rhetoric makes you powerful and in the state. And you can get elected to high offices and have political power. Well, tyrants have the most political power of all. They can do anything they want. I mean, all they have to do is, if you're the tyrant, a tyrant is a strong man, a dictator, tyrant. That's what the Greek word is, tyrant. But you're like a dictator, Saddam Hussein and that crazy guy in Syria, Assad. Anyway, probably Putin in Moscow, the guy, the Kim guy in North Korea. These are tyrants, okay? And if you're a tyrant, you can pretty much just do anything you want. I mean, if you want to put someone to death, put them to death. If you want to take their property, take their property. Anything. I mean, tyrants have absolute power, and that is rhetoric is promising power. So this is not as strange as it seems. I mean, it seems like we're going off on a whole different tangent here, kind of, but it is very much related. Socrates is like, it does not, doesn't everybody want to be a tyrant? And by the way, probably a lot of people are like, yeah, I like to have absolute power. And Socrates' response is, no, tyrants are the least powerful in the state, because what they do is not good for the possessor, he says. It's a man without intelligence doing what seems good. Actions aim beyond the intermediate. They're done for the sake of the good, the ultimate purpose. And power should be wielded for the sake of the good, and the tyrant doesn't know what that is. So he should be pitied rather than envied. Basically, what he's saying here is, look, he's acknowledging that the tyrant can do anything he wants to do. He's not saying he's not denying that, but the problem is the tyrant doesn't know what's good. Even for the possessor, that means even for the tyrant himself. Even for the tyrant himself, he doesn't even know what's good for his own self, let alone for the people that he's ruling over. That's a given, probably. But I mean, the thing, yes, he can do anything he wants to do, but it's not even benefiting himself at all. He should be pitied rather than envied, he says. And then Socrates goes on to say, it is better to suffer than to do wrong, and it is better to be punished. This is a big turn here in this dialogue and in this discussion, because we started out with philosophers facing off with sophists, and rhetoric being opposed to dialectic, and that was what happened with when he was in his discussion with Gorgias. Now we're kind of going into the territory of morality in general, because if you think about this question, it's kind of the question about why you should be moral at all. It is better to suffer wrong than it is to do wrong. And if you do something wrong, it is better to be punished. That is kind of the question of morality, that you should not ever do wrong. It's better to suffer wrong from others than to actually do wrong. And if you do something wrong, then you should be punished for doing that wrong thing. This is very much a broad question of morality. He says, and Socrates says, you can always do wrong if you're willing to suffer the consequences. But we're talking, in this case, let's talk about when you can get away with it. Like the tyrant. The tyrant can do wrong all the time. He never has to suffer any consequences. Well, actually, if you look in history, a lot of tyrants did suffer consequences and look at what happened to Saddam Hussein. And a lot of tyrants, Roman emperors, a lot of them got killed. So in the end, they kind of do get their just desserts. But what if you can just get away with it? Like a tyrant generally can, just get away with whatever, Stalin or something. Why should you behave yourself and do the right thing if you could just get away with doing wrong things, if you can just steal from people and kill people and whatever you want to do, and there's no consequences? That's the question. Paulus responds that many evil men are happy. He tells a story about this guy in a neighboring kingdom that was the illegitimate son of the king. In other words, his mother was not the queen, like a bastard son of the king. In other words, and that meant that he had no chance of getting the throne because he was an illegitimate child of the king. Well, that's seemingly what it meant. But the guy decided he hatched a plan. He's like, well, I could get the throne if I kill everybody in my entire family, which he did. His brothers, his sisters, his mother, his father, his uncle. He wiped out his entire family until he was the only one left. And then he took power. And Paulus is pointing at this guy saying, well, he's happy. Socrates responds that, I don't know that guy, but I don't think so, is his response. He says, only the noble and good are happy. All right, let me, a translational thing real quick here. Eudaimonia is the term being translated as happy. And eudaimonia does not mean this. It's not a great translation. Happy is not a great translation into English. Eudaimonia means doing well, generally being good overall in your life. Happy does not really, sometimes it does. If you say, I have a happy life, you mean that, but it's not like, oh, I bought something and it made me happy, or my friend came over, it made me happy, because eudaimonia is not a passing, like momentary thing. It's a long-term thing. Like Aristotle, for Aristotle, eudaimonia was an extremely important concept, and he says you can't be happy, eudaimonia happy, or you can't judge whether someone is happy, eudaimonia happy, until after you're dead. In other words, you have to measure your entire life to see whether you have eudaimonia. So I point that out because when he says only the noble and good are happy, if you think of happy as being this kind of overall happy, well-being in your entire life, it's more plausible. It makes a lot more sense. I mean, as I said, a lot of tyrants come to a bad end. They don't have friends, that kind of things. I mean, are you really having a good life overall? Probably not. And then he says, and it doesn't matter what the masses think. I don't care if everybody thinks being a tyrant is a great thing, which that was actually a much more popular belief back in the ancient times, that people envied the tyrant in his power. It also kind of, it's like, we're not putting this up for a vote, the democracy thing. Okay. He says, for the truth, we must consult the masses, we do not consult the masses, but only the argument. For the truth, we have to consult the argument. The truth is never refuted. And he says he only needs one witness, and that's you, Paulus, you. If you think I'm wrong, prove me wrong with argument. I don't care if I'm not taking a vote, I don't care what everybody thinks. Follow the argument, prove me wrong. This is very critical, okay? The truth is never refuted. And relate this to what Socrates' whole project was, because Socrates is going around refuting people all the time. He may think, oh, he's just an asshole, whatever, But if the truth is never refuted, the whole point is you try to chase down the argument and find something that will not get refuted. Then you found the truth. When you find something that cannot be refuted, then you found the truth. This is a key precept in philosophy. Okay. When you find something that cannot be refuted, then you found the truth. And yes, it is a moving target a little bit, because it may not be refuted at the time, but someone may refute it later. Yeah. But that is the aim. All right. And then he also says, in fact, the evildoer is happier when punished. And then he has this kind of quick argument. I know this is a quick argument. Plato does does expand on this a little bit, this idea. Well, a lot more in other places, like, for instance, the Republic. But here he just kind of gives a quick argument. And again, kind of think about this as Would Paulus be convinced about this if he was the guy talking? So what's more shameful? Is it more shameful to do wrong or to suffer wrong? Paulus is like, well, clearly it's more shameful to do wrong. This is sort of like a simple question. Is it more shameful to be the victim or the perpetrator? So is it more shameful to be the thief or the one that got stolen from, the rapist or the rape victim? I mean, which one is more shameful? It's the person doing the crime that's more shameful. Why is that the case? Well, the only thing that could account for the fact that it's more shameful is because it's more evil. It could be, by the way, it's interesting, he does acknowledge it's a little bit shameful to be the victim too. I mean, and that's true. I mean, if someone corners you in an alley and pulls a knife on you and you hand over your belongings, you may, after the guy walks away, you may think, damn, I should have fought back. So there's a little shame in that, but not like being the perpetrator. That's the shameful thing, you know. The shameful thing is being the criminal. And what could account for the fact that that's more shameful? The only thing that could account for that is because it's more evil. And that's the linchpin, that's the nail in the coffin here, because if it's more evil, then it's wrong. And same thing that happened to Gorgias. Socrates says, and you don't like evil, do you? And Paulus acknowledges that fact and says, no, I'm not for evil. I don't want evil. Well, then you have to agree with me that it is more shameful and more wrong to do evil, and therefore to do wrong is worse than to suffer wrong. His argument about punishment is a little bit sketchy. He has this whole thing about partaking, the agent-patient thing. I'm not even going to talk about that because maybe there's something there, but I'm not. It's sort of unconvincing. I think maybe the other argument where he talks about fortune and body and soul and wealth and poverty versus health and disease and justice and injustice, maybe a little bit better. Because so if you're, in terms of fortune, you have wealth and poverty. In terms of body, you have health and disease. In terms of soul, you have justice and injustice. And he compares to being sick to being unjust and says, well, if you're sick, you have to take medicine to get better. If you're unjust, you need to take medicine to get back to being just. In other words, you have to take your medicine, and that is punishment. So you want to be punished. I think this is simply an appeal to your your conscience. If you've done something wrong, you want to atone for it, and then you can feel better with yourself after you've atoned for your whatever bad thing you did. All right, finally, he says, rhetoric seeks power without truth, and so it is useless. And this is rejecting rhetoric completely. Rhetoric seeks truth without or power without truth, and therefore it is useless, Socrates says, unless you use rhetoric to make sure your enemies aren't punished. And here Callicles thinks that Socrates has lost his mind, and we'll turn to Callicles. All right, let me say something here. When you read Plato, and this is going to be even more important when we get to Callicles, when you read Plato, you have to understand that there's two conversations happening. There is the conversation that Socrates is having with, say, Paulus in this case, but there's also another conversation going on, and you have to pay attention to that fact. It is Plato conversing with you, the reader. I say this because maybe that argument that Socrates made to Plato is not terribly convincing. It's plausible that someone like Paulus would be convinced by that argument. But the more important question is, are you convinced by Plato? Do you, the reader, believe that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong and better to be punished? He's making this appeal to you as the reader, you in trying to get you to think about that. Are you that person that would think that? Hopefully, yes, is the answer. Clearly, Plato would hope that you would agree with him. On the other hand, does Plato think that everybody will agree with him? Certainly not. And you can tell that from the next character, Callicles, who there's no way in hell he's going to be convinced by this argument. And that kind of shows that Plato is well aware of the fact that a lot of people, no matter what you say to them, are not going to agree with it. I mean, Callicles is just never going to agree with Plato's position. He can't, there's no way he could convince this guy. And he knows there are people around like that, like Callicles. That's why he puts this in there. But okay. But what kind of a person is Callicles? That's kind of the question. All right, so Callicles thinks he's like, all right, just to boot this and start this off. Why does Callicles think that Socrates has lost his mind? Well, because when Socrates says you should make sure your enemies aren't punished, that is absolutely opposed to the whole Greek idea. Greeks did not think about turn the other cheek. That was not their motto. Okay, this is before Christ. Okay, no one thought turn the other cheek. That idea never even come up. This is before Christ. Okay, for Greeks, you help your friends and you harm your enemies. You hurt your enemies. So why would you make sure your enemies aren't punished? Sounds like you're trying to help your enemies. That's why Callicles thinks that sounds crazy. He's like, what? You're supposed to harm your enemies, not help them. The interesting thing is that Socrates is actually saying harm your enemies. Not that Callicles could have caught this because he's not thinking in the depth and the way that Socrates is, but Socrates thinks that the worst thing you could be is unjust. The worst, having a bad soul, being unjust, that's the worst state that the human being can be in. And you need to get punished to fix that. So if you want to really hurt your enemies, make sure they don't get punished, because then they're going to be in a bad state. So that is harming your enemies. So for Socrates, he is saying harm your enemies, but Callicles is not catching that at all. Anyway, and Callicles is pretty irate at this point. And okay, we'll stop and talk about Callicles in a moment.